The Crow 1994 is a film starring Brandon Lee that was directed by Alex Parias and written by David Sho and John Shirley. The Crow story is not unique, as it's a classic tragic love story about our protagonist, our anti-hero so to speak, that wants to avenge their love who was tragically R-worded and killed. But the way the film goes about telling the story truly is unique, and before we break it down, there is one big elephant in the room when discussing this film in particular, but we will save that for afterwards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and break down The Crow. Our story follows Brandon Lee as Eric Draven, a rock musician whom on Devil's Night in the crime-ravaged city of Detroit is shot and thrown out a window as he's trying to defend the love of his life from being raped and killed. And although Shelly may have survived the encounter, she is seriously wounded. Police Chief Daryl Albridge accompanies Shelly to the hospital, but unfortunately she eventually succumbs to her wounds and dies. The narration goes on to talk about the legend of the Crow, and it goes on to state that if a person dies under tragic circumstances, the Crow can resurrect their restless spirit to set things right. Exactly 1 year later, as the graves of Eric and Shelly are visited by a little girl named Sarah, a crow lands on Eric's gravestone and subsequently resurrects him. Eric returns to his ravaged apartment with visions and glimpses of the atrocities that took place exactly 1 year ago. Eventually, Eric realizes that he has come back from the grave as something beyond human comprehension that cannot simply be killed. He dons black and white face paint and seeks to take revenge on the ones who are ultimately responsible for Shelly's death. Throughout the story, you see Eric following the Crow and following a trail of clues to the ones that murdered Shelly, and eventually, one by one, Eric picks all these guys off in gruesome fashion, all the while healing from all the damage he's taken. Eventually, Eric would visit Albridge to confirm some of his findings, and upon visiting Albridge, he would learn that Albridge stayed with Shelly all the way up until when she died. Eric touches Albridge, absorbing the pain Shelly felt. After leaving Albridge's place, Eric would go on to save Sarah from being hit by a car, revealing to Sarah that he has been resurrected after all. Eric continues on his rampage, systematically picking off all the ones on his list in the most gruesome fashion, all the while being guided by the Crow. Eventually, Eric would catch up with Top Dollar and his half-sister Mika, who is also his lover, played by none other than Bei Ling. But unfortunately, they do manage to evade Eric, with Mika hypothesizing that the source of Eric's power and immortality is the Crow. Later on in the story, Top Dollar and Mika would have their right-hand man abduct Sarah as she was walking home, with Eric being alerted to the situation via the Crow, and he would go confront the two in a rundown church. Unfortunately, during the entire confrontation, the Crow is wounded, rendering Eric vulnerable, and while Eric proceeds to go toe-to-toe with Top Dollar and the crew, Albridge shows up to lend Eric some much-needed backup in the form of firepower. After a massive shootout, Top Dollar grabs Sarah and retreats to the rooftop of the church. Eric pursues Top Dollar, where he confronts him on the rooftop. As Eric is duking it out with Top Dollar, unfortunately Top Dollar has the upper hand, as Eric is still badly wounded from the encounter earlier. Eric eventually does see an opening in the fight and manages to grab Top Dollar, transferring all Shelly's pain to him. This causes him to stumble off the rooftop and fall down, and as he falls down, he is impaled by a gargoyle, finally killing him. The story ends with Eric returning to the grave of Shelly, where her spirit returns to comfort him and lay his mind, body, and soul to rest. This is a brilliant ending for a brilliant story. So the unfortunate elephant in the room is that Brandon Lee was unfortunately fatally wounded by a prop gun during filming. As he had already finished most of his scenes, the film was completed through script rewrites and stunt doubles and digital effects. After Lee's death, they figured since the film was so close to completion, completing it would be the best thing to do in remembrance of Brandon Lee's legacy. And honestly, I think that was a great idea. R.I.P. Brandon Lee. Now, you know what I don't think was such a great idea? So now we have The Crow 2024, starring Bill Skarsgård as Eric Draven and directed by Rupert Sanders while being adapted by Zach Balin and Will Schneider. Now, instead of having a gothic tone, this movie comes across more emo than anything, and that's really not a bad thing if done right. Now, the story starts off with our hero having some kind of flashback to the death of his favorite horse or some shit, and while this is all going on, there's a slew of crows around him, and I guess this is supposed to be symbolic. And while all this is happening, his mom is passed out on the couch from what appears to be some drug-induced coma. I'm not sure because it was never actually elaborated on. In the next scene, we have this random blonde chick who's apparently one of Shelly's friends, and she's frantically calling Shelly as she has came upon some evidence that these bad guys are doing something bad. But Shelly doesn't really want to be involved. Unfortunately, the bad guys end up catching up to blonde chick, and she eventually gets zeroed, but she did manage to send the evidence to Shelly beforehand. Now with Shelly having this evidence against her will, the bad guys are now after her, and while she's trying to evade them, she eventually bumps into some cops, and as she bumps into some cops, she drops her bag where all her drugs fall out, and she's arrested for drug possession. If this sounds really fucking retarded and stupid, it's because it is. So flashback to our main character, he's in this goddamn rehab center wearing this goddamn pink jumpsuit, and he's really not doing much. And this is our first problem with this guy because the way he's written is just very bland and dull. He's a very unenergetic, very uncompelling, very passive hero. He really doesn't do shit to move the plot forward until halfway into the movie. So while he's in a rehab, he's dealing with your typical normal social outcast shit like getting bullied and shit, but eventually he meets a girl and they kind of hit it off. And to be honest, I shouldn't even say he meets a girl, it's more like she meets him because she does more to move the plot forward than he does in its entirety up until she dies. So these two knuckleheads hit it off and she wants to break out of rehab because, mind you, those bad guys are still coming for her due to the evidence she has, but they break out of rehab not even realizing that the bad guys are right behind them coming to the rehab center to get them. So it's just dumb luck that they happen to break out of rehab right before the bad guys got to them. So what's the very first thing they do? They go back to Shelly's house to party and get fucked up. Mind you, she has this vital evidence that her friend ended up getting killed for, but the first thing they do is go back to Shelly's house so they can pop some pills and get high as fuck. And during the course of all this partying, Shelly gives Eric a little bit of kitty cat, you know? She gives him some pussy cat. And I guess based off of this little bit of kitty she gave Eric, they form some kind of sacred bond that will give Eric a whole lot of plot armor later. Anyway, these guys end up doing some more partying at a nightclub, but eventually the bad guys do catch up to both Shelly and Eric, and Shelly and Eric end up getting zeroed by some B-rank henchmen that pretty much just grab them both and strangle them out with plastic bags. And after this happens, Eric ends up waking up in this random ass place that's not really elaborated on. I don't know if this is fucking purgatory or the upside down or some shit, but he talks to this Giancarlo Esposito looking motherfucker who tells him as long as his love is pure, he can go back and avenge Shelly or some shit. So Eric goes back and he finally realizes he's been resurrected as some sort of immortal. But Eric's not that strong. Like, this dude seriously gets his ass whooped several times throughout the show. And whenever he's seriously wounded, he screams like a little bitch. Like, there's several times where he got hurt hella badly, and even though he's immortal, he's screaming like a little ass girl. Like, you could probably literally just hit this dude in the back of the head with a big ass piece of wood and incapacitate him and bury his ass and he wouldn't come back. But now, after taking revenge on some of the dudes that were responsible for Shelly's death, we're nearly an hour into the movie and Eric is at his boy's house. But the bad guys end up getting a hold of their location and the bad guys show up and they zero Eric's boy and then they zero Eric, leaving him lying in a bathtub full of his own blood. And Eric, he doesn't get up either because his healing factor and his immortality stopped working because of reasons. Like, This version of the Crow is lame as fuck. Like, there's rules and shit, and you can be incapacitated, but this is where we're at. Anyway, somehow he fucked up his revenge plot, and he ends up back in the Upside Down, and the Giancarlo Esposito motherfucker tells him that he fucked up. He had a chance and he squandered it because his love needed to remain pure, and he fucked up by doubting their love or some shit. And now he tells him that now that you fucked up, you'll never see Shelly ever again. But Eric tells him, my soul for hers, and everything gets all dark and ominous, and he's like, if you do this, you'll never be able to see her again. And this whole thing sounds like a scam. It sounds like a setup from the beginning. But now the crows start calling and shit, and they start flying into Eric, and he starts transforming into the actual crow, I guess. And now the movie's actually ready to start crowing. So now it's like the last 30 minutes of the movie, and I guess because all those crows entered Eric's body, now he's like the badass he was always meant to be from the beginning. So he goes to the opera and he confronts all these assholes. And upon arriving at the opera, admittedly, the whole fight scene in the opera is hella cool as he goes all John Wick on these assholes. It's some of the best shit in the entire movie, but it doesn't redeem how bad the movie is. But the opera scene is fucking legit. I will say that. They choreographed this shit perfectly, and I really enjoyed the ultra violence, even if some of it is absolutely ridiculous. And even during the whole opera shootout, this dude still gets incapacitated by bullets. Anyway, Eric catches up with the last big bad bitch. He walks in there with the head of the other bad guy, but she, in the end, is kind of still like, fuck you. So he ends up beheading her and presenting her head to the audience. And that's the end of that. But Eric does end up saving Shelly, as when he makes it back to the Upside Down, she randomly ascends out of the water and they both embrace. But unfortunately, they can't be together because of reasons. So eventually, as she's talking to Eric, she's slowly waking up from the defibrillators, and as she does wake up, she slowly realizes that Eric is dead and cannot be resuscitated. This is pretty much the end of the movie. So, is the movie bad? No. Is the movie good? Fuck no. Is the movie better than The Crow 1994? Fuck no. To sum this movie up, it's basically like our main protagonist. It's just there. It's not good. It's not bad. It's just there. It just exists. Thank you guys for watching. You know I'm going to get hit for copyright because I'm fucking covering 2 movies. So if you guys can like, comment, and sub, that would be greatly appreciated. If I can at least accumulate some subscribers from getting my video copyright claimed, that would be great. Thank you guys for watching. Have a beautiful day. Peace.